to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens. Welcome back to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I am Lee Johnson, and I'm very pleased to be joined by my co-hosts, Rick Lee and Devanya Havis. And today we are asking, are universals real? But before we get to that, let's get some drink orders and some rants or raves. Devanya, what are you drinking?
I am having an Arnold Palmer, which is a great classic non-alcoholic drink. And today I'm raving about Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, writer, poet, activist. In this moment, for me, what Lorde has to say is taking on an even greater resonance, especially that self-care is a political act.
Nice. Rick, what about you?
I'm going to have a spicy mezcalita. And today I am ranting about universities' capitulation to the Trump administration. I know that Columbia has been in the news. They are by no means the only university who has capitulated to ostensibly, and I would say obviously illegal executive orders by the president revolving around DEI, rounding up of student protesters, and perhaps also reporting people who are in this country who are not citizens. Too many universities are capitulating. And let me just say that Columbia, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale together could back all the other universities to just fight the Trump administration. I'm so pissed at their cowardice in the face of Donald Trump.
Seconded.
Lee, what about you?
Well, today I'm just going to have an iced tea. It has gotten to be spring-ish outside, and I made my first jug of iced tea for the spring, and so I'm not only going to order it here at the bar, but I'm actually already drinking one of those. And I am raving about Donnell McLaughlin's documentary, The Great American Game. So if you've never heard the word documentary before, that's because I don't think there ever has been a documentary before. But Donnell McLaughlin created this 45-minute long TikTok. That's right, 45-minute long TikTok, in which he basically tries to situate Kendrick Lamar's halftime show from the Super Bowl in the lineage of Black resistance writers in American history. I was scrolling through TikTok like a normal person scrolls through TikTok, expecting that within the next 60 seconds, I would be scrolling to the next TikTok. And I found myself 45 minutes later without questioning why I'm still looking at this same TikTok. It is so absolutely brilliant, amazingly well edited. It includes clips from all of the greats in Black intellectual history. You can now find it not only on TikTok, but also on YouTube, and I'm pretty sure Instagram and Facebook. His name is Donnell McLaughlin. His handle is @DonnellWrites. I cannot recommend this any more highly.
45 minutes, that's really just a tick. There is no talk.
So, Rick, I know that we are trying to answer this question, are universals real? First of all, what does that question even mean? And second of all, how do you expect this conversation to go?
Why would anyone ever think that out there in the world there are universals? This question is probably as old as philosophy in the West. So we say there are porcupines, but each one is really a porcupine. Don't they share in something that we might call porcupineness? We never meet porcupine or porcupineness in the world. We only meet individual porcupines. So isn't it the case that this thing we might call porcupineness is something like a construct by means of which we just gather together all these individuals under a common concept or idea? The first position, that universals are somehow real outside of our thinking, is, creatively enough, called realism. The second position, that universals are only concepts or names, is called nominalism. That comes from the Latin word nomen, which means name or even noun. So which side is right? Is porcupine something real, or is it a tool or a construct of our thinking? Now, I'll tell you one thing. if I order a beer in this bar and I get a Long Island iced tea instead, I'm going to be pissed. For real.
Rick, I'm really excited about this conversation, and I don't think it ever would have occurred to me prior to this to ask the question, are universals real? But as you have just set up this conversation, it does seem clear to me what's at issue here. As you said, the porcupineness. I might prefer porcupinity, but whatever. The porcupineness is the universal. And we're asking, is that actually some real thing out there in the world, independent of individual porcupines? Have I got the basic structure of the problem right?
Yeah, and I was only half joking when I said earlier that if I order a beer and I get a Long Island iced tea instead, I'm going to be pissed. Because that, I think, gets exactly to the point you were raising. Namely, isn't there something like beerness that makes all beers beer so that I know a beer when I see it? And there's wide variety, and, there's IPAs and stouts and so on. But if I get a Long Island iced tea, I'm like, no, and I'm sending it back. That, I think, is a really practical and concrete way to get at this question, because it can get really hairy pretty quickly in the finer points and the finer details.
Can I ask you just a preliminary question, which is, why are you calling this a universal and not an essence?
So I would say that these are really fundamentally connected things. We call them universal because there are more than one individuals that are or have this thing. We call porcupines a universal because there are many porcupines.
All of which possess porcupinity.
Well, whether they possess or share in or like how it is they come to be it or have it is a question we can get into. Technically, one could say that something is a universal which can be predicated of many things. Now, when I say it can be predicated of many things, here we go right into the heart of the debate, because someone might say, well, then you're just talking language, right? If it's just a matter of predication, then now these so-called universals are just words. And why are you acting as if, oh, there's a tree. Oh, there's my dog Scout. Oh, there's porcupinity. It just doesn't seem to happen that way.
Okay, so then we can presume that all things have an essence. An essence is different than the universal. I, of course, am playing devil's advocate here.
No, I appreciate that, because it could be the case that an essence is not universal or is not the same as these kinds of universals I'm talking about. So rather than me have the essence human, I could simply have the essence rickness or rickitude. That would not be shared by any other thing.
Rickety.
Or quididity, which is one of my favorite Middle Ages concepts. The whatness of Rick.
Yeah, and the whatness of Rick could just be Rickness. But it turns out that we're all pretty cool with saying I'm a human and Lee's a human and Devonya's a human. The question then would be, is that just a convention? That, you're a human, I'm a human, Lee's a human, or is it in fact something about us? And if it is something about each of us, then that thing exists outside of each of us and therefore outside all of the individuals.
So I followed you right up until that last point. It seemed like what you were saying is what universals are categories that gather together all individual things that share an essence. But then you said, if there is this group of things that share an essence that we refer to by virtue of a universal, then that universal, porcupinity or rickety or beerness, must exist outside of all of the individuals that share in that essence. That's where you lost me.
That question allows me to make a distinction between different kinds of realisms. And, since Devonya raised the Middle Ages, you're probably all aware that the medieval period is the period of distinctions. There are really, I think, two basic kinds of realism. One we could associate with Plato. So if you think about Plato, and I'm going to bastardize Plato a little bit, I'm going to assume that the Plato that we think of as a Platonist is Plato. I'm just going to use that name. I know there are people out there like my friend Drew Hyland, or to a certain extent even Michael Noss, who would say that Plato was not a Platonist, but I'm just going to use that name. Mm-hmm. Just roughly, Plato would say there is this idea or form human, and anything we call human is actually just a deficient similitude, a deficient similarity of that former idea, human. And in this version of Platonism, we would say that form, that idea, human, does exist outside of all individual humans. The other kind of realism is what often is called moderate realism. This is associated with Aristotle, but also Thomas Aquinas and many others, who would say, no, the universal doesn't have existence outside of the individuals, but it is not just the individuals. The individuals have something that they all share, namely humanity. That is what makes them human. But it's not just a construct of language or a construct of thought. It is what makes them be at all and is what makes them be what they are. So the consequence of moderate realism is if there were no individual humans, there would be no humanity or humanness. If there were no individual porcupines, there would be no porcupinity. And so the universal does not exist. And we might want to come and talk about, is there a difference between existing and being real? Mm-hmm. Universals don't exist other than individuals, but they are somehow a component that is not just belonging to that individual.
I want to take that invitation to step back from the ontological commitment just for a second and ask whether or not you would be okay with saying that universals function more or less like epistemic heuristics rather than ontological commitments. So maybe instead of asking whether universals exist out there in the world or whether they're real, we should just be asking how they function epistemically. Like, how does calling something human allow certain bodies in and leave others out? Because categories are never neutral. I mean, they do work. Sure. I'm a little bit less interested in the metaphysical reality of porcupinity than I am in what gets defined as a porcupine or what doesn't.
I think the separation of metaphysics and epistemology and ethics and aesthetics, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. And that for a philosopher like Aristotle or even many medieval philosophers, what something is and how something is known are intimately related questions, maybe even one and the same question. And so you can't really ask the question of knowing it without asking the question, what is it? That being said, modern and contemporary philosophers tend to come at this from an exclusively epistemological direction. And I would argue there are certain problems with that. Namely, that if knowing something is knowing it as it is, then we can't escape this question of what is it? We're going to have to address it one way or another. The other problem with just treating this epistemically is I wonder if you push this too far toward being arbitrary. And I think there would be problems with every universal being arbitrary. By the way, the problems with every universal being arbitrary are not just metaphysical, not just epistemological. I think they're actually political and ethical. In politics and ethics, we might want or need something like a non-arbitrary universal.
What if we said they're not arbitrary, but they are fictions? Kind of unpacking Gayatri Spivak's notion of strategic essentialism.
Right.
We might point out that while universals, human or porcupine or woman or black or anything else, are constructs, they're politically necessary fictions, and they have a purpose.
And I would wonder if certain of these fictions are necessary or they're fixed to do certain kinds of political work. And what I'm thinking about here is the challenge or the tyranny of the universal. So if we understand it as an abstract thing that determines a category, a fiction in the sense that Lee designed it, my next question is, how is it functioning? And I think Rick is getting at some of those questions as essential for our political engagement, but also as a matter of where we place our ethical commitments.
I don't know if we're listening to the same Rick, but it seems to me that Rick is not actually asking that question. It seems like Rick keeps wanting to sneak this ontological commitment back into the question. I'm fine with just saying, okay, these universals are fictions. It doesn't really matter whether they're real or whether they exist out there in the world. It doesn't actually really matter what their relationship to knowing them is. It only matters that we understand that they're fictions and that they serve some kind of pragmatic purpose. Rick seems to want to keep coming back to this question, are they real?
Well, I heard Rick suggesting, and Rick can clarify this for us.
Because there is only one Rick. Rick is not universal.
Right.
But it is, isn't it? I mean, I can refer to all the Ricks I know.
But there's a reason that Rick wants us to talk about universals, and that has something to do with how we might mobilize universals.
Hi, this is Rick.
Sounding in full Rickitude.
I want to come back to something, Lee, you said in jest that gets to a serious point. I do belong to the set of all people named Rick. But if you ask, what is it that we share? The answer is only the name. Mm-hmm. There's no part of our existential makeup, our ontological makeup that we share other than the name. Mm-hmm. And you might say, oh, but you share humanity. No.
But that's not what I'm referring to when I say Rickness. Yeah.
And Sean Hayes, the actor, he has a dog named Rick. Mm. So there are Ricks that are not human.
That's probably true of Rick, but it's not true of all names. So we can refer to a Chad or a Becky. And we're referring to an essence.
So, Lee, you're now pushing back on the ontological question because we call someone a Becky whose name isn't even Becky. And why do we do that? It's because they're being Becky.
Or a Chad who's not even a Chad, right?
Right. Or Karen who's not a Karen. And so I think your joking question actually gets to something serious. The social epistemologist Sally Haslinger talked about different kinds of sets. An extreme form would be a natural kind. You know, every grain of salt is salt, and it's salt in the same way, and that's just a natural kind. And then on the other end of the spectrum would be what she calls gerrymandered sets. Mm-hmm. Sets put together without having some necessary ontological core, although I would argue frequently when asked for justification, people have recourse back to that ontological core. Let me give you an example. Something like human. Historically in the West, human was taken as a universal, but it was actually a gerrymandered set to a certain extent because, to put it as Sylvia Wynter does, some people weren't human. That shows, although there might be an ontological basis there, an ontological core there, that set was gerrymandered, and it was gerrymandered on an exclusionary basis. But the rejoinder to that, notice, is to say, hey, those people are human, to insist that they have the very thing that the universal is claiming.
What I worry about, though, is that to say that a set is gerrymandered is to assume already the ontological reality, the ontological existence of the set, and then to say it did not include all the things that it should have included. What we could just as easily say is that the human universal was gerrymandered, and then we re-gerrymandered it, basically appealing to a kind of fundamental nominalism to the category.
So there are sets, according to Haslinger, that are gerrymandered, and there is no presupposition of a set. An example I could come up with is at the beginning of The Order of Things, Foucault quotes that passage from Borges where a character looks at an encyclopedia and the encyclopedia has as groupings things like the stuff the cat just spilled, things on the left side of my desk, things that break when you drop them. So all of these, we could say, yes, they're categories, but actually they're just made up. This is a kind of example that Aristotle uses to talk about the importance of something like an essence. The stuff on my desk, I have an empty beer can over here. I have a cup of coffee. I have a pile of books. I have pad and paper. That's not something. That's just what Aristotle calls a heap. I don't think humans are like a heap. They have something that the stuff on my desk doesn't have. The stuff on my desk shares nothing except that it's on my desk.
Heads up, listeners, we left Twitter. We packed up, shut the lights off, and logged out permanently. Not because it stopped being fun, but because it stopped being ethical. So if you're looking for us online, don't go lurking in Elon's hellscape anymore. Instead, follow us where the real conversation happens, on Blue Sky. That's where we're sharing our episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and all the half-baked takes we used to share on Twitter. If you love what we do here, don't just sit there. Press pause now and go follow us. You can find us at Hotel Bar Sessions on Blue Sky. No ads, no bots, no billionaire nonsense, just the good stuff. And it is our very strong preference that we keep our conversation with you going on that platform. Of course, you can also find us on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and we appreciate your likes or follows on all of those platforms. Now, back to the conversation.
Rick has been talking to us about this distinction between made-up categories and other categories that have something, I'm going to say akin to essence, because I always get a little nudgy when we start talking about essentialism and essences and so forth.
Same.
And my question here has to do with social ontology. So if we understand made-up categories as being a thing, don't made-up categories come to exist in our social engagements and our social interactions? Another way of saying that is to say made-up categories have a social ontology that often gives them the materiality. In other words, race may not exist in the biological sense, but I can look at the ways that race has real consequences, that its existence and its understanding have existing impacts and effects on people. I was thinking about my children when they were young, and they called every caretaker mom. Even dads were moms because it named a particular role from their experience of that role of caretakers.
Funny story, I have a friend who teaches kindergarten, and she has told me several times that often they'll refer to their teachers as mom or nana or granny or whoever their actual at-home caretaker is. But last year, for the first time, she had a student call her by another name. Do you know what it was?
No.
Alexa. True story.
Well, Alexa is my primary caretaker, too.
Right.
Alexa makes me nervous.
I think, Devanya, you are right to first lay out the fact that post-20th century, almost no one is a straight-faced essentialist anymore. From a number of directions, we've seen important, serious, and maybe even devastating criticisms of essentialism, essences, and with that falls almost all universals. Many of those are gathered under what I indicated before, namely pointing out the abuse of power that stands at the center of these universals. So not only who gets to count as a human, but who gets to name human. Not only who gets to count as white, but who gets to name white, and so on. So I think we need to take seriously these really, really important attacks on essentialism. However, I also worry equally about attacks on essentialism that smuggle it in the back door. If I want to critique the universal human and I say, aha, but there are others who are humans, I'm insisting on the reality of that essence in order to critique the reality of the category human that has been deployed.
Mm-hmm.
Here's where I think I disagree with you, and I'm really open to being persuaded otherwise. But again, going back to Spivak's strategic essentialism, which I'll admit for listeners sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it's actually a really helpful way to navigate this debate. The idea is that categories like human or woman are socially constructed categories, maybe even dangerously constructed, and we sometimes have to lean on them strategically to get things done. Mm-hmm. So if you're fighting for human rights or women's rights, you don't usually get very far by insisting that gender is a spectrum or every identity is fluid, right? That might be true, but politically, it's necessary to stabilize those identities long enough to demand justice, to do justice work. So why can't I say I don't believe in universals in some metaphysical out there existing in the world kind of way, but I do think that they can be politically useful fictions, and I don't want to throw them away.
Oh, you can say that, and then you're a nominalist. Nominalists are the other side of the spectrum. They start out by recognizing, as all realists except the Platonist realists do, that when we look out in the world, all we meet out there, all we confront out there are individuals. And so if that's the case, then the universality must come not from the things out there, but come from us. And then people say, well, it's a structure of our thinking or it's a structure of our language. That language has common nouns and proper nouns, so our language structures things that way. Or other people will say, well, we conceptualize things and we put them in categories and so on. What I worry about is that whenever a category is attacked as being a merely socially constructed category, one recourse that people often take is to, as I would put it, naturalize it.
Yeah.
That is to say, no, that is really how things are. I think we're all prone to this, that whenever there's an onslaught against, for example, my humanity, or an onslaught against what it means to be American, or, all sorts of things, the recourse is to say, no, there is a reality there that all these things share. And if we were wrong about who shared it before or what that reality is, that doesn't mean that there isn't a reality out there. There's something really compelling about the metaphysics below this. And that's the reason why I'm not a realist, but I'm also not willing to stop investigating the metaphysics that is lurking below here, whether one's a realist or a nominalist.
When you say I'm not a realist, but I'm interested in investigating the metaphysics below, I think I'm going to need some clarification on that, because as Devanya and I have been talking about, socially constructed categories are real.
Right.
They may not exist in the way that
tables and chairs.
Or I was trying to not say tables or chairs.
Or the forms.
Well, I mean, that's really what's at issue, right? I may not be able to take them into a lab and define them as natural kinds in the way that I might define other existing things as natural kinds.
Right.
So why is it that we can't just stipulate social realities are realities? They're not the same kinds of realities as quote unquote natural realities, physical material realities, but they're real. Why doesn't that alleviate your impulse to always want to qualify your realism with, but I'm also still interested in metaphysics?
Well, Lee, thank you for that really detailed, interesting metaphysics that you just gave. You just did metaphysics. I mean, we're not getting away from it, and your metaphysical position is one I share. I have a slogan for it. Reality is not the same as existence. We somehow lost a robust vocabulary when talking about how things are. When we conflate reality and existing, then we become critically befuddled when it turns out that, hey, women make 67 cents for every dollar. I think it's now up to 70. Gender's not real. Oh, how does this happen? And I think you just pointed out, no, it is real. It's just not an existing thing. There's a phrase that the American pragmatist C.S. Peirce uses, not in this context, I should point out, but I just love it. I call something real, which is like a stuck door against which the shoulder pushes. By pointing out it doesn't exist, the door's not open, right? I'm still pushing against the door.
I really like that reference. I'm not an expert in Peirce or in American pragmatism, but one of the things that I do remember clearly from reading his work is that at least one way out of the metaphysical deadlock here is to make a distinction between what's real and what exists.
Exactly.
And for Peirce, something is real if it, as he says, resists our will.
Right.
If it exerts force or consequence in our experience. So if we take something like race, biologically, maybe race doesn't exist. Well, biologically, race doesn't exist. But socially, economically, politically, it is real as
shit.
A toaster or a table or a chair. It shapes outcomes. It organizes institutions. And I think that that's a super helpful distinction. So we could say something like humanity or gender might not exist in some ontological sense, but they're still real in ways that we have to take seriously. And that kind of realism, which I would want to call something like a critical realism, lets us hold on to the weight of universals without committing to some essentialist nonsense.
I agree 100%. That's the position I've come down to. It's a position that Peirce, by the way, calls a realism that's a hair's breadth away from nominalism. There is a kind of realism that I want to maintain for critical purposes.
Yeah.
And you pointed out all of those. Also, notice when we get to all of these social universals, or better put, socially constructed universals, there is a non-arbitrariness to them that I want to hold on to in order to avoid the John Ashworth, I'm not a racist in my heart.
Yeah.
The answer to that is, I don't give a shit where you're a racist. I don't even give a shit about you being a racist or not being a racist. That's not the point. And so the non-arbitrariness of these socially constructed universals is something that brings us a little bit closer in feel, if not in reality, to realism.
I want to return to an exploration of nominalism in some form, because I am struggling with how we're using the idea of what is arbitrary.
Mm-hmm.
Things in our mind are often arbitrary in the sense that what we can perceive, what we can see, we assume to constitute our reality. And those are not universal. And so our reality in many ways has a quality of arbitrariness. I'm not going to say it is entirely arbitrary. And then when we begin to think about things that give our reality meaning or that shape our reality, namely signs and symbols, they are arbitrary in certain ways. You know, what a cross represents may be interpreted as a plus sign, for example, to other people. The sign itself is arbitrary, and the meaning is something that I work out in conversation. So I'm curious about what is wrong with nominalism in the sense of the arbitrariness. Is there a problem with it because it means anything goes once we get rid of universals? Is it problematic because we are not critically working out the chain of relationality for what begins as arbitrary and then becomes more fixed?
Before you answer that, if I could just tag on, because what I hear implied in Devonia's question is a reference back to something that you've referenced, Rick, many times on this podcast, which is the kinds of discussions that we have in a space that requires reasons. And it does seem to me that part of what Devonia is asking is to call a universal arbitrary seems to mean that you have no reasons, shareable reasons that you could give to other people for choosing that category as opposed to some other category. And I think we know that that's not the kind of arbitrariness that is at work in categories like race or gender or the human.
Yeah, I would make a distinction between arbitrary and contingent. So it's contingent that I see this bird flying past my window because it depends on my sitting here at this time while the bird, who knows, maybe a hawk is chasing it and that's why it came here, yada, yada, yada. But that's not arbitrary in the sense that I could have just as easily seen an octopus fly past my window.
Could you really just as easily see an octopus?
Okay, but now, Lee, you're pointing out the stuck door. You could say, well, I call birds octopi, and all adults will say, well, that's cute if you do that at home, but words have meaning.
Yeah.
And so then the question is, does the meaning of this word derive from social convention, or does the meaning of the word derive from what something is? Now let me shift to a whole different category and see if we might come back to the middle. This is an example that the medieval philosopher Duns Scotus gives. If I jump off a 10-story tower, all the way down, I could want it to be otherwise, but still I'm going to hit the ground. Now, that's something that is not arbitrary, that is not contingent. No matter how we structure the world, no matter what language I'm speaking, that is going to happen. And there is no situation, no context, no social reality in which that's not going to happen. And so in that case, doesn't something like gravity function like a universal? Now, if laws can function as universals, then we might start looking to see if that helps us talk about these other socially constructed universals in a way that shows, although they might be contingent, they are certainly not arbitrary.
Okay, so forgive my daftness here. I'm not sure I entirely followed that example. If I could, I'd like to go back to your example of stuff on my desk.
Yeah.
Which seems like both an arbitrary and a contingent category.
Right.
I think that categories like the human or a woman or race are contingent in the same way, but are not arbitrary in the same way.
I agree. And part of my concern, Devanya, with this arbitrariness is that I don't want these socially constructed universals to devolve one way or another to the choice of individuals, even a group of individuals, that I want to show how these function like structures that have a reality that is independent of, as Lee put it earlier, the will of all individuals.
There is no such thing as the will of all individuals, right?
Right.
Like that's a category that doesn't exist. I mean, it's a category that exists. It's a fictional category.
To which we seem to perpetually refer.
Yeah, 100%.
And we have categories to which we constantly refer, and they are dependent also upon condition. If Duns Scotus jumps out of the 10-story building, if it's on the moon where gravity doesn't exist, then we can't assume that gravity is a universal for that fall. We often don't think about the relationality and context. It's embedded in there, but it's not necessarily how we're thinking these distinctions. And yet it seems crucially important for how we understand the context for meaning and the context for interpreting the arbitrariness and the contingency. They're all bound up.
The law of gravity is the same on the moon as it is on Earth. It's just that the moon is a different size object, and therefore we apply the same mathematics and can figure out what falls and what doesn't fall, how far, how fast, and so on. But it's the same gravity.
Think back to the first time you listened to Hotel Bar Sessions. Maybe you came upon an episode randomly. Maybe a friend sent it to you. Maybe you weren't even sure what you were getting into, but then, pow, you were hooked. You kept listening. You started looking forward to new episodes, and now you're part of this conversation. But here's the thing. This show only exists because people like you support it. So if you've ever laughed, argued with us out loud, or sent an episode to a friend, it's time to step up. Become a patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. Or, if a monthly pledge isn't your thing, visit hotelbarpodcast.com to make a one-time contribution. You've been here this long, why not pull up a chair and assist with keeping the bar open?
Okay, so I am going to try to dip my toes into both of yours nerdy world for a second and make a Star Trek reference. But hear me out. As far as I understand, the Borg from Star Trek are a perfect metaphor for the danger of universals taken too far. So the Borg erase individuality in the name of the collective. Everyone gets absorbed into the one, some totalizing universal identity, and it's terrifying. But it's also familiar. You see that logic, I think, in nationalism, even in some religious communities. The individual doesn't matter. What matters is conformity to the universal. So while I get the appeal of shared categories, we all want to belong. We all want solidarity. I do think that we have to be on guard against universals that flatten difference instead of holding it together.
Yeah.
Because when the universal becomes too real, too rigid, it stops being a tool and it starts being a trap.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, which is why I am not a realist, except in the sense that I want to hold on to a metaphysics of socially constructed categories for critical purposes. And I think that one of those critical purposes is to affirm the absolute difference of individuals. By absolute, I mean irreducible. That my individuality is irreducible to my humanity, my whiteness or my maleness, middle classness, and so on. That there is a resistance. And by the way, this is where Peirce actually does use the stuck door. There is a resistance that the individual provides even to this kind of categorization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but there's the rub, right? Because how do you affirm the absolute radical individuality of individuals without first being able to identify them under some universal category?
Right. I mean, this philosopher I didn't meet him. This philosopher I mentioned earlier, Duns Scotus, he has quite a complex, and he was known as the subtle doctor in the Middle Ages, so complex and subtle metaphysical solution to this. He is one of the first to talk about the difference between reality and existing. And he says universals are real, only individuals exist. But what makes an individual is irreducible. That is, that it is a difference without a category. In the world, we just confront individuals that are characterized by a difference without a category. That doesn't mean that, for example, my humanity isn't real. I really am human. But it means that humanity is in some kind of combination with this irreducible difference.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a complicated philosophical knot to unravel. I'm not entirely sure I agree with that, and it's too late in the podcast to unpack this, but I just want to point out that at the very beginning of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, he seems to give us some universals. The first universal categories that we encounter are things like this, that, here, now. Those preserve the irreducible individuality that you're describing, but they're so broad as categories that they only function as epistemological categories.
And to go back to your example of the Borg harvest individuality for the benefit of the collective. So they're not eliminating individuality as such. They're eliminating individuals in a pursuit of perfection.
But Rick seemed to be suggesting that individuals cannot be eliminated qua individuals.
I don't want to make this either about Hegel or about the Borg.
That's going to be on your tombstone.
And I would say those are one and the same thing. But the Borg have to maintain individuality because every individual becomes a part.
Yes.
But a stronger realism would say parts have no existence outside of the whole. If something is real that has effects, then we have to say that parts are real. I think also the more we figure out about the human body, and this is an example that goes back to Spinoza, like there are animals in me and there are plants in me that are themselves individuals, but I can't be me without them. And they are all part of the collective that is Rick, and they all will be assimilated, or maybe I will eventually be assimilated by them.
But they all, as individuals, would not be included under the category Rickness.
That's right. They would have their own. I mean, if we give names to like this bacterium, hey, Steve, and that one's Josie. But I think that's a kind of metaphysics or ontology that you find in a philosopher like Gilles Deleuze, the 20th century French philosopher, who wants to say, look, we haven't focused enough on how structures are put together. Individuality and universality is a question of effect. de Vanya came close earlier, and Lee, you also came close earlier to saying we should look at universals from the perspective of what do they do. And I added to that, we should look at universals from the perspective of who's doing it and what do they do. And by who, I don't mean individuals there. I mean who's constituted as belonging and who's constituted as excluded. And I think if we continue playing out, reality is what has effects, we get a much more sophisticated metaphysics that is more adequate both to the world we find ourselves in and the world we want to live in, the world we want to find ourselves in.
I think what you're saying about effects, I agree with. And I want to add, effects are about relationality too. Mm-hmm. That often in the Western philosophical tradition, we don't think as much about context and relationality as other philosophical traditions. In Ubuntu philosophy, in which I'm not an expert, there seems to be an attention to how individuality and collectivity are deeply interrelated. And I'm not so sure that Western philosophy takes that on. And I, again, think that these are reasons of context and what we've highlighted in this philosophical tradition.
I completely agree with you, de Vanya. I think that's exactly right.
Hey, Hotel Barflies, it's Rick Lee. One of my favorite games, and I think it's one of the most philosophical, is Would You Rather? You know, the game where you're given two choices and you have to choose one. For example, would you like to smell like feet or smell like eggs? Would you rather run on your hands or be able to write with your feet? Well, how about this one? Would you rather keep listening to this podcast for free and feel mildly guilty every time we ask for support? Or pitch in a few bucks and bask in the warm glow of knowing you're a true patron of the pod? Okay, look, if you're choosing option A, that's fine, we'll still love you. But option B? That's the choice of a real barfly, a legend, someone who helps keep this podcast alive. So don't hesitate. Head to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and join the folks making this show possible. Or if you're more of a casual spender, hit up hotelbarpodcast.com and send us a one-time tip. You know what to do. Now, back to the show.
I don't often do this at the end of an episode, but we did begin this episode with the question, are universals real? And I'm still not entirely sure that I know whether or not Rick thinks that universals are real. So I just want to give him one chance here at the end while the bartender is giving us last call to clarify, are universals real?
I would argue that universals are real and universals do not exist. All of the critiques we've been discussing of essentialism and universality, I take all of them seriously while also recognizing that there are things in the world that have effects that don't exist, like the planet Jupiter and a worm. And that's why I say they are real, but they don't exist. And I want to focus on this having effects. And to take up de Vanya's last point, I think we have to understand that probably everything that is just a relation. I go back then to like my own body. That isn't my own body, just a relation among things that can be seen from one perspective as an individual and from another perspective as Rick. I think there it depends on what it is you're interested in. If you want to fix my heart valve, then you treat my heart as an individual. But if you want to talk to me about being healthy, then you say, oh, you should run more, you should eat a balanced diet, all those other stupid things. And there you're not interested in the bacteria in my gut or the pumping of my blood or so on.
Well, our bartender has actually given us last call, and that is a universal category that everyone understands, every bar attendee understands, and so we've got to roll out of here. This was a great conversation, Rick. I know that we tickled all of your buttons with this, so I appreciate you indulging Devonian and I in trying to work out whether or not universals are real.
And I ordered a whiskey for last call, and gosh darn it, I got a whiskey.
All right, guys, I'll catch you next time.
Take care.
Bye.